hello, welcome to class. I wanted you to just do a little bit of notes about methods using that worksheet from yesterday. So if you don't already have that out, find it. If you need an extra copy, there should be one with the sub. All right, our goal is to learn how to use methods in our programs. All right, and if you just remember real quick from yesterday, see if you can remember the definition of a method. Pause the video if needed. Method from yesterday is just a small piece of code that performs a specific task. So think of math.pow that just does a base to a certain exponent. It performs a specific task. Okay, so on this sheet, here's an example of a class. And remember, when we do methods, you kind of break your class into little tasks, and then those are different methods. Right, so main has been a method we've done a bunch, which is the one that runs again at the start, and it opens and closes, and then you can see here we have a second method. All right, I just want to label some information with you because I feel like it's pretty new and just trying to get a handle on all this stuff. Thought it might be helpful to just take a few notes here. All right, so the first thing down here, if you want to just label this part, that's the method heading or the method definition. I guess the heading would just be that first line there, and the whole thing would be the definition. So if you just want to make a note that this is the method heading. All right, sorry, I'll try to make that a little bit smaller. Put it in black. All right, so that's the method heading. And then again, if you just want to make a note here that this part is like what the method does, or like the method definition, I guess would be a way to think of it. All right, just a little more vocab from yesterday again. This find sum right here, that's the name of the method. So when you do a method, you public static, this is the return type, and then the name of the method. This next part is optional, right? You don't actually have to have input parameters, but this one actually has two input parameters that are both ints. So you have to give them a name and then also what type of variable they are. So here they're both ints, right? So if you just want to label some of this stuff on the sheet, I think that might be good. This int is a return type. All right, so if you just want to label that, right, that's the return type. And then this find sum, that is the name of the method. And again, I would just label some of this right on your sheet with me. And then these last parts are, again, like the input parameters. And you can have one input parameter, no input parameters, 12 input parameters. It really depends. This one just happens to have 2. Okay, so that's the declaration, which won't actually do anything. If you hit run with just this public static int find sum, it won't do anything. To make the code run, you actually have to call it. For now, we're going to be calling it from main. All right, so to do that, you just use the name. And then in this case, there has to be 2 ints based on our definition down here. We'd have to pass in 2 ints. And then in this case, this returns an int. So much like we did math.pow, we're going to store that in a variable called sum, and then we can do whatever we want. We can add to the sum, we can display it. In this case, we're just displaying it. Okay, so this is a good example. This is a pretty complex method because it takes in 2 input parameters and returns a single int and stores it here in sum. All right, so maybe if you want to take a look at this example, first, let's just say what would be the name of the method that's being written here. Okay, and hopefully you can see that the name of this one is actually called double number. All right, and I just wanted to talk about briefly like probably a pretty common misconception with methods, and that is that in this case, we would maybe expect that this number 1, if we ran this code, would be 10. All right, the idea being it comes in as 5, we double it, and then it just prints out a 10 at this point. Okay, but what actually is happening is this variable num1 comes in as an input parameter, Okay, and then you can't actually alter these input parameters down here in the method. All right, it'll actually be a whole new variable called a. Like it starts off when in the main method it's defined as num1, but when we get down into this little method, num1 doesn't actually exist. It's now this value of a. It got passed in here, so we get a 5. And when this method starts, this variable a gets defined, declared, and takes on a value of 5. Okay, and then it just gets multiplied with 2, so result becomes 10, and then we return result. All right, and so what happens up here is the return type isn't stored, right? So we do technically have a return type of 10, or a return value of 10, but it's just not stored, right? So if we wanted to store it, and this is where you might want to like make a note of this, is um, if we wanted to actually store it, we would have to come here and do something like int num2 equals the double of num1, right? And then down here we would want to print out that num2, and then it would turn as a value of 10. Okay, so I know that's kind of confusing, but I thought I would type it up here and see if I could get you a better picture of it. Okay, sorry, I just had to resize my window there for a second. So here's this code in Eclipse, and the way it is now, again, it'll run. If I hit run, it'll actually display 5, right? And that again happens because this number 5 comes into the method, but you can't actually alter it, right? It'll just stay as 5 up in main, right? Again, if you need to alter something up here in main, then you need to return it to main and store it, right? So in this case, we could again do int num2, right, and then just store what gets returned from this method, that int, and then print that out, right? And that'll get it to display 10. Um, Again, this is maybe a little confusing, but we could, an alternate way to do that would be to just overwrite num1. So this would now just say we want num1, this line 6 here would say num1, we want to take on the return value from when we double num1. So it'll come in as a 5 and then get overwritten with the return type of 10, right? And if we ran it that way, we're just kind of reusing the num1 variable there until we get the 10 that we want. Okay, so this is just a long way of saying you can't alter the value inside of the method. Okay, back to our note sheet. I think we talked about this one already from yesterday. All right, so here's where I think it'll start to get hard, but this is, we just got to practice it basically. So again, there's two parts to a method. Up here, what you'll see is a declaration. So we start with the public static. It looks like the return type is double. The name is cube volume. It takes in a side length, and then it just does the volume, which looks like it's side length times side length times side length. Not even really, oh yeah, that would be the right volume for a cube. That'd be the right formula, and then it returns that. Okay, so what I'd like you to do is see if you can fill in how would you call this from main, right? What would be the one line in main that we'd use to call this? All right, so just take a second to think about it, pause the video, and if you can't get it, then hopefully I'll go through the answer with you in a second. All right, so I'm going to kind of do this piecemeal. It's going to look kind of weird, but if I was to call it from main, I would need to use its name. All right, and then I would need to pass in this case, a double, representing the side length of the cube, so maybe just 4.0. All right, and so that would run this code actually, but it wouldn't store what gets returned. All right, so if I want to do that, I look at the heading and it looks like it's returning a double. So I would need to make a double variable called result or something and set that to be equal to whatever is returned from the cube value method. All right, so in this case, I think it would be 4 times 4 times 4, which I think would be 64. So at the end of this code here, result would have the value of 64. All right, so there's two parts, creating it and then calling the method. Okay, just real briefly, this isn't on your sheet, but I just want to mention like a method is maybe almost like a function in math where you have like some inputs that go in and then you get a result out. All right. And so the inputs usually are in the end here on the parentheses. So this next int one, actually there is no input. And its output would be x. All right. An int value would come out at the other end. All right. So the cool idea of methods is we don't have to even know how scan next int works or get next int works. We just have to call it correctly and then realize what's being returned and then store that. Okay, so a good way to think of methods is like input output, almost like functions in math, right? Way back, maybe if you've been in algebra 2, you've seen that like f of x equals 2x plus 7 or 8. Right, so that in that case we have an input of x and we just return whatever calculation here. So this would have input of x and return like an f of x or a y value. Okay, so on the back, I'm going to go through these with you, but I would like you to kind of try them first. Right, so here's an example of calling math.pow, which we've done in our code before. And so see if you can answer these questions and then unpause the video. All right, back with you. So how many input parameters? They go at the end, right? So down here, math.pow, its name is pow, and it takes in 2 ints. So how many input parameters are there? 2, and they are both, actually I think they both might be doubles. It's kind of hard to tell from this code, but we'll call them both doubles. Okay, and the first input parameter in this case would be a double with the value of 2, right? Specifically, the first input parameter is the 2. Okay, and so where is it stored, right? So it looks like it's being stored in the variable called result, right? So it's returning a double, which is being restored for future use in this variable called result. All right, same deal. See if you can answer the questions related to this, and then I'll go through the answers with you. Pause the video. All right, name of this method is right there, right? So when we call it, we're calling it with its name of random, right? And this is a little bit different than the examples we did before because we have to do the math dot first, but I'm hoping that the idea will be the same. How many input parameters does it have? Actually, there's none there, so that was somewhat of a trick. None. And the output is stored in the variable called random number. Okay, and it looks like the output to this, which we've done before, again, is a double. All right, and specifically, we hopefully remember that a double, which is between 0 and 1, not including 1. All right, so the output type there is a double. Okay, last one again. This one might be a little confusing, but I'm going to have you see if you can identify any methods in here, and then any input and output of the methods. All right, so there's technically 2 different methods. This out.println is actually a method that takes in a string variable that we've used before. And then the second one is the not next line, which doesn't have any input parameters there. So the 2 methods are .println and the next line. All right, so I guess I could type this out for you real quick. So the print ln is the method, and then the next line is also a method. Okay, and again, the input to the print line would be a string with no real output, and then for next line there is no input, and the output is actually a string variable because we're storing it there in name. All right, so the rest of this sheet there, it talks a little bit about some coding examples, but I'm going to say don't worry about those. I'll do them when we get back. In the remaining time of class, work on those Chapter 5 programs. All right, so hopefully you can get started on some of them. Use these notes as a guide. You can also look back at the code we had from class. That's out up there on the Google Drive folder. So just use the remaining time to work on the Chapter 5 programs. I'll be back tomorrow.